We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if...
All right. Hey, welcome to the Soapboxx Podcast. I'm your host, TJ Legacy. And this episode, we are talking about the new blueprint of justice. Did we just experience a new blueprint of justice? But of course, every week we are joined with my co-host all the way from NYC. We got my man, Alan York. What's going on, man? How you doing? How you feeling?
Man, I'm feeling good. I just had a couple sips of orange juice. I'm rejuvenated. How y'all feeling?
Good. Thank you. Are you feeling good? Are you under the weather or what? Is it like we just got the orange juice update?
Yeah, that's it. Normally, I've been starting my days with a good carton of orange juice while I've been on my vegan journey to just kind of kickstart some energy before my little workout and all that. So it's just that this carton happened to follow me throughout the day. So, I'm still sipping today. Look, we all right. We got some vitamin C.
I appreciate you with continuing your path of self-love and self-care. And speaking of self-love and self-care, we love her like a play cousin. She is a friend of the show, more than a friend of the show. She is a guest co-host and host of Bottomless Conversations podcast. Morgan, what's going on, Morgan? How you doing?
Hey, what's going on? How y'all doing?
We're doing great. Thank you again for being here. Morgan got the blowout, so we're already going to get all the likes and shares on the blowout alone.
Yeah, just trying something different,
Yes, loving it. So listen, this week, family, it's been a tough week.
Wait, I'm sorry. Before we get started, TJ, how are you doing? You didn't tell us. Introduce yourself and tell us how you doing.
You know what? This is probably the first podcast anybody's ever asked me, and I'm the host. So I appreciate that. I'm actually doing well, Alan. I'm doing really well. I had some big accomplishments this week. It's been a tough week with all the trial and everything, but I had some unspoken good victories this week. So I am feeling good, feeling healthy, and ready to rock and break this trial and everything down. So I definitely appreciate that. But yes, so with that being said, making sure that we break down the Derek Chauvin trial. We all heard the verdict. I wanted to make sure we brought on a heavy hitter, and one of the heavy hitters that I know in the judicial system, the judicial fight for justice. I was introduced to her this past election cycle. She's a former candidate for state attorney, Miami-Dade County. So welcome to the Soapboxx Podcast. This is actually her second time on the Soapboxx Podcast, but officially as a guest, attorney Melba Pearson. How are you? Welcome to the Soapboxx Podcast.
I'm doing well, TJ. How are y'all doing? Thank you so much for having me.
No, we love it. We appreciate it. See, we wanted to make sure that we brought someone on here. We can only go so far with our commentary, and we wanted to be as responsible as we can, but make sure we break some of the things down from a legal perspective to get your expertise. So we appreciate you, lending your expertise and your time to us. I know we got you for a short little while, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So, hey, Morgan, what's popping? Let's tell us what's popping.
Man, what's popping is a very well-deserved guilty verdict in the Derek Chauvin's case. I think we all were kind of a little bit optimistic, but, we did get the outcome that we wanted, more so of an accountability, that we've all been wanting. So he pretty much was found guilty on all three charges: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Now, of course, we don't know, what the sentencing would be, and that's going to take a little while, from my understanding, at least about 8 weeks before we know exactly, what that sentencing is going to look like. We do know, based on those three charges, each charge has a maximum amount of years that you can get. So, fingers crossed that, justice is going to continue to be served once they get to the sentencing.
Absolutely. My first question I want to ask you, I'm so used to calling him Attorney Pearson. Let me be.
You can call me Melba. Listen,
we'll say we're a very informal show, but I know everybody worked hard for their titles. I'll say Attorney Melba. Attorney Melba. From a prosecutorial standpoint, what was the difference when you look at this case? What was the difference between this trial and the pursuit of justice? Right, and getting a guilty verdict from some of the other trials that in these unarmed shootings that have gone to trial. Was it because it was captured on video? We've had others captured on video. What was really the turning point in this case that led to the guilty verdict, in your estimation?
Yeah. So first off, I gotta give mad props to the prosecution team, right? Because they were not playing with y'all. They brought their A game. They made sure that the first week was can we just rip your heart out and throw it on the floor? They brought witnesses from the age of 9 years old to, the older gentleman, Mr. McMillan, who broke down on the stand. I think many of you remember his really painful testimony about how he tried to de-escalate the situation and advise, George Floyd, listen, man, you're not going to win this, go with them, whatever. And to watch him die in front of his eyes was just, to see an elderly man that reminded me of my dad and my uncles. I mean, I was done. It just killed me. But they were very deliberate in making sure to set the scene, not only from an emotional perspective, but from an evidentiary perspective. So while they brought witnesses that, pulled at your heartstrings, they also each of them came with evidence. Either they were the ones who took the video, or they were standing there and watched this go down. And so it was just to the point that, first of all, the facts of this case were just so egregious. The fact that you kneel on a man's neck, as we discovered in the trial, for 9 minutes and 30 seconds, as opposed to the 8 minutes and 46 seconds we had all been talking about, to really see that in full display was a lot. And then the other thing that really distinguished this case was the fact that the blue wall in this instance crumbled. Legit, the chief of police came in and testified to be I don't know him. That's not how we train people, right? Came. I have never, ever seen in any of these cases the chief of police in that jurisdiction come out and be no, we don't co-sign this. The head of the homicide unit of the Minneapolis Police Department, he came out and testified as well and was that's not how we're trained. And this is, this could result in death. We all knew that. We were trained that if you take somebody and handcuff them and put them on their chest, because of the fact that your chest is so constricted, you can't breathe, you're supposed to turn them over after they're handcuffed. You're not supposed to leave them face down. So they were very clear in spelling out how this was against protocol, against policy, and against their training. So that was, I think, a huge turning point in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was almost everybody watching it, we saw the viral video. We thought this is a slam dunk, right? This case, oh my goodness, caught it on video. The cops but yet still, when that verdict was being read, didn't we all just kind of take a step back oh, here comes the okie doke? We all kind of rolled our eyes. I mean, even I was just they said guilty. I was oh, so it kind of worked today. Okay, is that...
Listen, I nearly broke my poor husband's hand because I was squeezing it so hard. As we're there, we were watching. I think we were watching CNN, HLN, one of those channels, and and he's reading through it. I'm literally squeezing his hand. My heart is going like I had tried the case, right? Because I remember that feeling of waiting for a verdict, and you're okay, is the jury going to come back guilty? What's going to happen? You're trying to, peek over the judge's bench to see if you can read through the paper. You're going through all these feelings, waiting for the verdict. And, again, having seen how, unfortunately, like, for instance, in the George Zimmerman case and other cases, that the jury, unfortunately, gets desensitized to seeing that video over and over again, 3-4 times a day for a month. It's possible that they're like, okay, well, yeah, I've seen it. It's not as shocking as it was the first time you saw it, right? So I was really concerned about that, but I was hopeful that it was going to either be third-degree murder or second-degree manslaughter. Like, I didn't think that they were going to come back guilty on second. So when they came through with every single charge guilty, watch out. I thought I was getting murdered because I was screaming my head off in my house, like, oh my God, all three charges.
So I know everybody was excited, and as they should be. People, this is how it should, when you talk about, this is when we talk about the new blueprint of justice, right? You talked about the blue wall crumbling, where they had to, it was almost reluctantly, they had to testify and separate themselves, because I've always said on this show, we have to separate ourselves from law enforcement officers who serve the community valiantly, and those who are white supremacists who have infiltrated law enforcement, who are racially targeting African Americans and carrying out injustice, who are still protected by the overall system of, with the blue shield. So when we talk about sentencing, because right now we're all, the guilty verdict is one thing, but now we're talking about sentences. As a prosecutor, and I know this is Minnesota law, and I'm not sure if there's obviously a difference between Florida. What does a prosecutor do in this instance? Like, there's 8 weeks, there's sentences. Do they write the judge, slip them a note, say, hey, we want the full max? How does it? You break it down for the Soapboxx Nation, for those who are watching this.
Okay, so I'm going to dial back for a second and kind of explain what the potential sentence could be, and then talk about what's going to happen in the next 8 weeks. So
please do.
He was found guilty of second-degree murder, which carries in Minnesota a maximum of 40 years. And you are right, TJ, every state, their laws are different. So you got to do your research and all of that. And luckily, I'm just kind of a geek like that, so I do the research. So the maximum for second-degree murder is 40 years. The maximum for third-degree murder is 25 years. And the maximum for manslaughter is 10 years. Now, the way that they're going to handle it in Minnesota, they're not going to run it concurrent. So it's not like 40 plus 25 plus 10. They're going to pick the highest charge, which is second-degree murder. And so he faces a maximum of 40 years. Now, there's this thing called guidelines.
Is that because of, not to cut you off, is that because of the law, or is that a choice from the prosecutors?
No, that's the statutory max that they can't have. Yeah. So the law provides a maximum of 40 years in prison for second-degree murder. And of course, again, that changes from state to state. In Florida, the maximum for second-degree murder is life. So, so then basically, there's this formula called the guidelines, right? And it shifts from state to state, but basically it's a formula. You have a spreadsheet, you put in what charges the person has currently, what charges they faced in the past. So have they been convicted in the past? You add in, like, was there a firearm used? Was there, was it a child or an elderly person that was the victim? And a number comes out, right? So in this case, the bottom of his guidelines is 12.5 years. So he will not get less than 12 and a half years in prison. And the maximum he could get is 40. Now, the prosecutors, before the trial started, filed a motion to basically saying, because this crime was so horrible, because it was done in broad daylight, all these people, including children, these are aggravating circumstances, and he should not get the minimum, right? So he should not get 12 and a half. So my guess is that the prosecutor at the time of sentencing is going to ask for either the max, like 40 years, or like 25 to 30 years or so, right? I don't see them asking for less than 25 years. And so the reason why they had to file that motion is normally in Minnesota, the judges pretty much go with the bottom of the guidelines unless move away from that. And they're laying out the grounds as to why the judge move away from that and give Chauvin more at the time of sentencing.
Yeah.
Between now and the 8-week mark when sentencing actually happens, the prosecutors are going to be doing their due diligence. They're going to be reaching out for victim impact statements. So maybe, George Floyd's daughter or his girlfriend or something will be testifying that day to talk about the impact that his loss has had on their lives, and just sort of like, getting all their ducks in a row for sentencing to make sure they make the best arguments to the judge. They're also tighten up their game with regards to the appeal, right? Because Chauvin going to appeal. You're not going to take that lying down.
He is, because Amber Geiger actually, from the Bolton John case, it was actually announced that she's appealing her decision after all that hugging and crying. And I want forgiveness. She still wanted an appeal to get out of prison. Yeah, because
prison sucks. Like, there's nothing good about it. So you sit there and you're like, you better somebody find me some grounds because I need to go home. Especially somebody who is a police officer who is housed not necessarily in the same unit, but in the same place as people you arrested and put away. So that's not exactly a hospitable environment for.
That's why that was my caveat. I'm cool. Like, give him 25, but at least can we put in there, and I know it's probably we can't do it, I'm talking like a lay person, but let's make sure with some general population. I'm talking, I want to make sure that he's getting the full experience of his stay in prison. Like, am I wrong? Am I wrong for that? Like, I want to make sure that he's not protected, and because we're seeing that now, even with the case with Mr. Wright, who was shot, where we're having officers, even after they're convicted or arrested, still be protected in these systems, whether it's prison or whether it's, they're not an officer anymore, but they got security around their house. No, I want Derek Chauvin to have that same energy and to make sure that he can be in general population.
Yeah, that's not going to happen, though, because the prison does not want a high-profile death on their watch, right? Like, I hate to say it, but it's just sort of like it, because of so much, sort of like, for instance, like Jeffrey Dahmer, right? If you remember back in the day, that dude, there was a serial killer, he was horrible, whatever. So he was I think he was in a segregated wing, but he ended up getting shanked by somebody who was like, listen, we're not down with what you did to these kids. And so it kind of blew back on the prison. And, in a different situation, the prison may have been sued if they didn't give him enough protection and security. Because remember, when you go into custody, you are under the care and control of the Department of Corrections. So if they're not coming correct, then they can be exposed to liability if they did not take the proper steps to protect you. So he's not going to be in general pop. He'll be in a segregated ward.
Okay.
Alan, go ahead.
Yeah, I do have a question, and just kind of going back. First off, thank you so much for coming on the show, Ms. Pearson. I appreciate you. So just kind of going back to what you said in regards to possibly the jury being desensitized just because they're seeing the video so much. Is that, or can that be an active plan of action for the defense in this case to possibly drag the trial out as much as possible to maybe filter some of the quote unquote emotion out, and so they can kind of get their legal jargon off? And, on the opposite, is it possible, not necessarily in this case, but in general, any sort of situations like this, especially where it's like a murder on video, where either side will kind of play to the length to their advantage, or maybe that be just a strategy coming into it?
Yeah. So I think that in some ways the defense will want to play the tape over and over again just to desensitize people. As for dragging the trial out, it's kind of hard for the defense to do that because the judge is the one who keeps the pace. So if you lingering, judge is like, listen, I don't have all year to try this case, right? Like, we want to get this done. We have a jury sitting here who has stepped out of their lives completely in order to sit and hear this case. Like, they're not going to work. They're not seeing their kids. In this instance, because it was a high profile case, the jury is what was called sequestered. So in other words, we're staying in a hotel with no TV, no Netflix, no nothing, right? They literally scoop up all their stuff so that they are not exposed to any news about the case, or more importantly, for their safety, they're not being intimidated, right? Because we remember back in the day, like all the mob movies or whatever, like, you know, you a jury for a mob dude and somehow a horse's head ends up in your bed, right? Like that sort of thing. And then the next day you're like, oh yeah, I vote not guilty. Right. So you sequester a jury to keep them protected as well as not to expose them to media about the case. So when a jury is sequestered, they know that they're placing, the court knows they're placing an additional hurdle in front of folks. And so they're like, listen, if we're going to do this, we're going to move this case along as quickly as possible because it's rude to keep people out of their lives for so long. And you also have the issue of if it takes too long, you run the risk of people not showing back up, right? So even though you'll have 12 jurors and maybe 2 alternates, if you keep dragging it on for 6 months and you didn't warn people in advance, this is a 6-month trial, you know, things happen and folks are just like, you know what, I'm not coming in, or I'm sick, or, you know, I had a family emergency. And then now you've got to turn to the alternates. So that, you know, that's another reason why the judge is always going to make sure to move the case along.
Do you I know when you ran, you know, for the last election cycle, when you ran for state attorney, you ran on a platform of reform. You know, you wanted to reform the judicial system. So much has happened, even since, you know, since the George Floyd case, and I mean, since the George Floyd murder. I have a 2-part question for you. Do you still feel like this system, this judicial system, can be, or really policing, can policing be reformed? Or are you, or does it need to be abolished? Where do you stand on that spectrum, and where do we go in the scope of policing post the Derek Chauvin verdict?
Yeah. So first of all, I think policing can be reformed, but it's not an easy road. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not something that, you know, you're going to have to drag folks to the table kicking and screaming. And part of it is going to have to be more Derek Chauvins from the standpoint of more police officers being held accountable for harming Black and brown people. Because once there's accountability, once there's a penalty to your actions, you're going to straighten up right quick. Right. And because of the fact that police officers who are bad actors, again, not all police officers, but I'm talking about the subsegment that are bad actors, that, you know, those folks have been able to operate with impunity for so long. And, you know, if you think about the fact that the Minneapolis Police Union paid for Derek Chauvin's defense and they full-throatedly defended him in the media and all of that. So that's the rub. You have rank and file officers who are like, yeah, I'm not okay with that. You have chiefs who are like, I'm not okay with that, and I'm trying to fire the bad officers. But then you have the police union on a lot of occasions standing in the way, blocking that ability to fire people, because then they go to arbitration and it becomes this whole long drawn out process. And many times the bad cops end up getting their jobs back. So but at the same token, if we look at the national landscape, you know, I want to say it was the state of Maryland that now passed legislation that allows individuals to sue police officers, basically attacking that qualified immunity that allows them to kind of have the shield of, oh, you were operating as a police officer while on duty, therefore you can't be sued or have any financial liability for your actions. That got stripped away from them in Maryland. You know, and we have other states around the country that are really looking at robust changes to policing and for more criminal justice reform. And of course, you have the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that passed Congress. And now the question is what's going to happen in the Senate. But President Biden has made it very clear that he wants to sign it and he's in support of it. So I think that this can happen. We just have to move past the whole, okay, training will fix it. You know,
I'm off that. Yeah.
Fine. No, it has to be boom. Like it has to be accountability. It has to be folks getting fired and decertified so they can't go to another jurisdiction and still be a police officer, right? Because many times you see that happening, kind of like, you know, the priests that engage in pedophilia for a long time, they were just moved from parish to parish. It's the same thing in policing. These dudes may resign rather than face, you know, accountability or having to be on desk duty or whatever, but then they'll go to another department in the next county over, 2 counties over, get a job and continue to be a police officer. So until we make sure that, you know, police chiefs have the ability to fire bad actors, that bad actors can't get a job anywhere else, and also attacking the liability aspect, you know, there was a recent discussion around insurance. And so how all these police departments and cities and municipalities carry insurance for when there's a police shooting. So, for instance, when you see these big numbers, usually that's not coming from the taxpayer dollars, that's coming from insurance, right? So an insurance policy would cover it. If you do like doctors do, and if you keep getting, let's say a doctor, you keep getting malpractice suits, at some point your insurance is going to drop you. The same way like car insurance, you get into too many accidents, Allstate will drop you. Yeah. Flo ain't trying to have that. She's like, no.
Yeah.
So if we do the same for policing, that may change the game as well, because then it's like, oh, hold up. We can't run the risk of being uninsured because of these one or two police officers. We have to do something about this. So it's a multi-pronged approach that has to happen.
Right. And I also, here's the part that I don't like, because we have to take into account that the media is also in this. Dead Black bodies is big business. Like having the trial on, like people are profiting off of this. And we have from politicians to activists to media personnel, like people are, like we talk about desensitized, like people are so it's almost must see TV. And what I don't get, and this is just me making a statement, is like we saw the Stop Asian Hate campaign. Right. We saw that we had Asian people being attacked. Right. Then everybody in droves came out. We need legislation. However, when it comes to African Americans, how long have we been in this fight? And really, everybody's taken the blueprint from the civil rights movement and the work of African Americans, but we're not reaping the benefits for the blueprint. How much? But when we talk about the new blueprint of justice, the protests, and I know we have a lot of Republicans and some of these white supremacists on social media. They're complaining, saying that the verdict was because of mob justice. That's pulling up. Yes, exactly, and we're gonna definitely get to him. How much of that, putting pressure on people in the streets and the grassroots, like how much of that really had an impact? Because I think it had a lot of impact, but not mob. It's not a mob justice, but they knew, hey. Because reluctantly they put charges on Derek Chauvin. If people weren't in the streets, this doesn't happen. Am I wrong in that estimation?
In this instance, slightly, and let me tell you why. Because Keith Ellison, he is the Attorney General for the state of Minnesota. He was previously a congressman, and he's an African American man, and he's been in this fight for a minute. So there was no way on his watch in his state that this was going to go to the side. He promptly went and snatched it up from the Hennepin County District Attorney and says, I got this, right? So that's basically how that went down. Now, I don't think that the jury, contrary to our dear governor's, bless his heart, his misguided belief. Listen, fact of the matter is the jury was not thinking about, oh crap, there might be a riot if we come back with a not guilty, right? That's not what they're thinking about. They're thinking about the evidence. They're thinking about the last month of their lives, sitting in day out, listening to all these witnesses, looking at literally hundreds of exhibits, pieces of evidence, and they made a decision based on that. So that is such disrespect to the jury process. And I mean, that just again, I know he's not a stupid guy. So I know just red meat he's throwing out to his base. But the reality is the people looked at the facts and they were like, listen, Dylan Roof could shoot up a church of unarmed, peaceful people, and he didn't get a knee to the neck. He got a Big Mac and a nice, sweet escort to the police station. So why is George Floyd over a $20 bill that may or may not have been counterfeit, that he may or may not have even known was counterfeit, which was something that came out in the trial because it was more, the attention was being placed more on his friend. How come he had to lose his life? Right? Like, and the whole they didn't comply. I could show you a million videos of white people not complying and they not ending up dead. So again, he's just being deliberately obtuse because having to address racial injustice is not part of his agenda at all. He's too busy playing footsie with white supremacists. So,
and you brought up a good point, because you brought up Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and I know for all of our listeners who listen to us in Poland and UK, and for some reason we did no marketing, but they found our podcast and they listened to us, so we appreciate them. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. We talked about it. Justice Javonni, a reporter who's our co-host. She is a reporter in Tallahassee. She reported on HB1, House Bill 1, which is basically the anti-protest bill. I wanted to get your thoughts on Governor Ron DeSantis, the anti-protest bill, and all of the sheriffs from other counties flanking. I'll call them the Proud Boys in Blue. Wink, wink. I'll call them the Proud Boys in Blue. Governor Ron DeSantis. Do you think it's being challenged now? An attorney in Orlando, Winter Park, actually filed suit to challenge whether it's constitutional. What are your thoughts on the HB1 bill, and if it's constitutional or not?
Sure. So the way that I've always liked to explain this bill is that it was a solution in search of a problem. Having been a prosecutor for 16 years and, having tried everything from grand theft to double murder, listen, there were plenty of laws that any prosecutor worth their salt could use to address if, God forbid, the January 6th attempted coup happened here, or just any average protest, if that goes totally awry. There's plenty of charges. If you throw a brick through a business and you break the window, that's criminal mischief. It's a third-degree felony in Florida. If you actually go in and steal from the store as part of a looting activity, that's called burglary, right? There's charges already. So this was not an issue. And what was so disingenuous is that the governor got on Fox News and said, oh, what's happening in Portland, what's happening in Seattle and New York, that's not going to happen here. Florida, we got things under control. We don't play like that in Florida. Yet he turns around and basically telegraphs an even more violent version of this bill. If you may recall, it actually was going to give stand your ground protections to people who ran over protesters, right?
Correct.
Correct. After all the backlash, some of those things got stripped. But then two Republican legislators introduced it basically January 7th or January 8th and tried to be like, oh, but this was about the Capitol riots and making sure that we're safe here in Florida. And we're like, honey, no, we're not blind and we're not stupid. We remember all his statements last summer where he was saying specifically that he wanted to, attack the folks that were out there protesting for social justice. So the bill is unconstitutional. It is an attack on free speech. And for those of you who may not know, I was deputy director of the ACLU of Florida. So constitutional issues was my bread and butter.
We got the right one. We got the right one today. Okay.
Listen, you sure enough do. So the reality is, even though, and let's just benefit of the doubt that the intent was not targeting Black and brown organizers. We know it was, but let's pretend for a second it wasn't. The reality is, if you put a law in place that ends up harming somebody's constitutional rights, that makes it unconstitutional, right? No matter what your intent was. If the outcome is that unconstitutional things are happening to people, then the law gets struck down. So I think that because of the fact that organizers will be hesitant to organize protests out of fear because, number one, the law is vague. It doesn't really itemize what inciting a riot really is, right? And how one gets to that point. So it's vague. So then how do you govern yourself accordingly to make sure you don't get held liable for something that you didn't do, didn't co-sign, didn't want, right? So with that lack of clarity, that's one ground for the suit to succeed. The second part is the after effect, which is because you're not sure, you're not going to speak out, which is your First Amendment right to be able to speak freely, right? And so if that is being affected, then again, that is another reason for the law to be unconstitutional. Now, bigger picture, many of the justices on the state Supreme Court here in Florida were appointed by this governor. So on the state side, not that. On the federal side, if this suit is filed in federal court because it's a constitutional issue, then we might see more progress. But again, when you get to the Court of Appeals level in the Fed system, many of those judges, those were judges, were appointed by the last president. So, and they weren't appointed necessarily because of their depth of experience and their embrace of social justice, right? Or their diversity. So again, that's why it is so important to vote in every single election because, we've lost control over the courts for a good 10 to 20 years because these are lifetime appointments. So unless somebody steps down or retires, you're stuck.
And that's always been my problem with the Democratic Party is that some Democrats are playing checkers and these Republicans, they're playing chess, they're playing the long game. So even after they're gone, they still have influence over these laws, over these districts, over these counties, and really over people's lives. Attorney Melba Pearson, I want to thank you for your time and be respectful of your time. We can have you on forever, but I know I want to be respectful of your time. I do want to ask you this before you have to run. I know you have to row. What's next for Attorney Melba Pearson? I haven't talked to you in a good little while. I know we're on social media. Is a political future still in the cards, or are we on to other things? What is your continued fight for reform, for justice? What does that look like for you?
Sure. So right now, I am the Director of Policy and Programs for the Center for the Administration of Justice that's housed at Florida International University. And my work revolves around data in prosecution as a tool for change and transparency. So we work with a variety of prosecutors' offices across the country where we develop data dashboards where they're able to show the community how they're doing with regards to diversity. Are there racial disparities in the way people are treated in the system? And when they see that data being like, oh, you got some problems over here, I work with them to help develop policies to be able to make changes so that it can positively impact the community. And I'm also building out a community engagement component so that the community is able to share their voice and co-create a new vision of justice in their communities. So that's been amazing so far. I've been there since right after the election, and it's been great. Now, for the long term, what I'm doing, I learned a lot of very painful lessons running for office for the first time, especially in a large county-wide race. I agree with you with the concerns with regards to the Democratic Party, which is why I'm going to watch what happens in 2022 and then make a decision at that point. We've got a gubernatorial race. We've got a number of state House and state Senate seats. We have a U.S. Senate seat with Marco Rubio being up for re-election. So I want to see how all the different progressive groups move. I want to see how the party moves in regards to this. And I also want to look at the voting patterns here in Miami-Dade County because we're becoming increasingly more red in demographics. So I'm not in suicide missions, right? Like,
it makes sense.
Then I'm not going to waste time and beg people for their hard-earned dollars to support my campaign when I have no chance of winning. That doesn't make sense. So I'm going to kind of look and see, and then I'll make my decision at the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, as to whether or not I'm going to run again, what makes sense, and where to go from there.
Well, Attorney Melba Pearson, you are definitely a heavy hitter, like we like to say on the Soapboxx Podcast, whether it's in the judicial system, whether it's grassroots, or whether you decide to ever run for elected office. We know that you're going to do great things. Please come back to the Soapboxx Podcast. You're welcome back anytime. So we appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank y'all for having me. It was great being on, and I look forward to doing this again soon.